Stan Hywet Hall and Gardens, the historic treasure of Akron and all of Northeast Ohio. The Stan Hywet Hall and Gardens Guild supports and promotes our beloved local historic landmark. Presents Julie Frey, Director of Museum Services and Curator at Stan Hywet Hall and Gardens, speaking about F.A. Seiberling and the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company. Recorded at the September 20th, 2022 Guild meeting held in the Carriage House meeting room at Stan Hywet Hall.
We'll get started on the actual meeting, which is a presentation by our one and only Julie, who the Manor House would not be run without her. Julie.
I like that I was just a first name. That's, I think, something I should transition into. So it's either
Miss Julie
or is it notoriety? So let me just, I thought that I was missing a slide, so I didn't think I was going to jog today, but I just did, up to the Manor House and back. And I was not missing a slide. I just misremembered the order of them. So we're on track. Yeah. So thank you for selecting this topic. This is something that I know a lot of you have a lot of interest in. It's a very complicated topic. Hopefully I will help detangle it somewhat. I will tell you that I had to give myself a cutoff point because the story does continue into the 1930s. So I stopped in 1928. So basically I also created a need for you to have me back. It was so I can come and do part 2 next year. We can talk about the 30s and the continued litigation that happened still as a result of the 1921 reorganization.
By the way, Julie, you're on schedule for March. Just to let you know.
For this topic or another one?
What's happening in the House for the season.
Okay. I don't think I knew that, so thank you. happy to come back. So I think I usually do March, don't I? Or I've done that in the past. It's all coming back to me. Okay. So yes, we're going to talk about, I'm going to give you some background on where Goodyear was kind of pre-1921 recession, talk about what happened in the recession, and then talk about that decade after the recession of all of the kind of blowback and ramifications of the decisions that were made at that time. And it was a good exercise. I had to do a lot of additional research, read a lot of newspaper articles over the past 48 hours and things like that, because there's a lot of nuances, a lot of things happening at any given time. There were 4 to 5 lawsuits happening at one time in the 1920s. So, and the newspapers would talk about them in overlapping, tangled ways. So I was like, oh, which one? Is that the Supreme Court case? Is that the Common Pleas case? Is that the one in Toledo? Is that the one in Columbus? Is that the one in Cincinnati? So I did my best to simplify it while still kind of giving you the nuts and bolts of everything. So please also understand, there's still a whole other layer. This could be a book, just this decade. So 1916, Goodyear is given the title of largest tire producer in the country. And this is largely due to F.A. Seiberling's invention with the engineer William State of the Seiberling State tire building machine, which is pictured here. This revolutionizes the tire building industry. This is the game changer for Goodyear. They are now able to produce tires at a rapid rate and really keep up with that expansion of the automobile industry that's happening at the same time. So just a quick snapshot. I couldn't find 1916, but there's some 1917 information. Sales figures over 103 million, over 10 million of that being net profit. And the value of the physical plant is over $12 million in 1917. So they're running a huge operation. And of course, as soon as FA reaches this summit of being the largest tire producer in the world, he decides, I want to be the largest rubber company in the world. Let's move the goal line. What's the next thing to achieve? At this point, U.S. Rubber is the largest rubber company in the world. They are a conglomerate of about a dozen smaller rubber companies, which includes the Diamond Rubber Company, which was a local one that was absorbed into them at a certain point, and that's what kind of pushed them over the top of being largest rubber company. So that's the new goal. At this time, also, Goodyear has almost 50% of original equipment business, which means they're selling to Chevrolet, Dort, Nash, Oakland, most of Buick and Olds as well. Their tightest relationship is with General Motors. They also have substantial contracts with Ford and many other smaller companies. So over 50% of cars that are leaving the factory are rolling out on Goodyear tires at this time. They also have 40% of the original truck business and 60% of original motorcycle business at this time. So this is where their bread and butter is coming from. So here's just a snapshot of who is on the board of directors. You can see a lot of names we're very familiar with there on the left. All of those are local Akron people. You'll see a big change as we talk about the reorganization. And then these are the officers and the positions that they were holding pre-1921. So we have FA, of course, CW. George Stottleman was their sales manager, Paul Litchfield being a vice president and factory manager, and then some other names below that may or may not be as familiar to you. Almost all of these people you'll see disappear in 1921. So just to put some faces with names, of course, we know FA and CW. Paul Litchfield's pictured on the right. He was an MIT graduate. He began working at at Goodyear in 1900. He was hired immediately as a factory manager, managing all the production. He had a really broad vision, not just for being innovative, being creative. He could kind of see all those moving parts as they were coming in and organize them efficiently. He was also had an ear and a mind to the worker and how they were fitting into everything and making sure that they felt heard, make sure that their needs were being met as well. So he had a very holistic approach to production and that factory worker's position in it. George Stottleman in the center was, as I said, sales manager. He was hired from a carriage tire business in January of 1902 and promoted to general sales manager in 1905. He was described as a very quiet and reserved man, but again, I had that vision to see how to put that sales, the logistics out there, figure out how to sell to all these different states, cities, communities, how to get Goodyear tires out there. So it was a group that came together very early. Goodyear was founded in 1898, as most of you know. So by 1902, these four men are all in place and stay with Goodyear for almost the next 20 years as a team. So how to grow? We want to be the largest rubber company in the world. How do we do it? So FA constantly needs capital to finance the manpower, the marketing campaigns, and the building expansions happening in Goodyear between 1916 and 1920. So you can see some figures here of the expansion of how many floor space, what we're getting towards as far as the Akron factory, employees. That's showing you kind of how it drops in 1921, but almost 30,000 employees in 1920, right before the recession starts. So Plant 2, it was a huge building boom in this 4-year period. Plant 2 begins in 1916. Goodyear Hall is started in 1917. The general office is enlarged in 1917, and they build 5 more buildings, 6A, 21, 21A, 29, and 29A, all in this time period. They ended up with 95 acres of floor space just at the Akron plant by 1920, and square footage increased 153%. So it was just go, go, go. FA made a speech in the spring of 1920. He said, "I'm ready to make this prophecy that it will only be a few years until the sun will always be rising and never setting on Goodyear factories. By which I mean that around the globe in practically every civilized country, we are going to have a Goodyear factory. And the sun in its orbit will always shine on the name Goodyear, some places on this old Mother Earth." So here's how we start. In 1919, construction begins on the Goodyear plant in Los Angeles. They purchased almost 500 acres for $1 million to build this plant. They began producing tires there 10 months later after buying the land, so they got that plant up very quickly. Rumors were circulating that FA was going to move production out of Akron to Los Angeles. He said absolutely not. This saves on transportation costs. Housing shortage in Akron was still a problem, so if they built a second plant where they had people that could live at a lower cost, Los Angeles was the boonies back then. And also there was fears of water shortage in Akron, which was not true in LA. It's true today, but not back then. But the Goodyear was the first tire company to build tires on the Pacific coast. At the same time, 1919, they purchased a rubber plant in Ontario, Canada. It was called the Durham Rubber Company. It already had existing sales branches throughout Canada, so it had a built-in infrastructure. They turned that into Goodyear, Canada. They also purchased, in 1917, a cotton mill in Killingsley, Connecticut. It was designed to give the company control over that raw material. You needed a lot of fabric to produce tires, so this was kind of streamlining that from start to finish, they would control that production. It also included a laboratory for fabric experiments, so they could continue to innovate, continue to find ways to make tires better, make them last longer. On the same vein, they purchased a cotton plantation in Arizona, the Southwest Cotton Company. It was almost 28,000 acres of land, and now there's a town in Arizona called Litchfield, Arizona, and that's where it was, named for Paul Litchfield. So again, that expansion to control the product from growth all the way till it makes its way to the tire. They also purchased in 1916 a rubber plantation in Sumatra, 20,000 acres. They started planting rubber trees there about 3 years later. So again, from the beginning, the inception of the raw material all the way to it makes it to its tire, they were trying to control. They also purchased a coal mine in Edina, Ohio, 4,700 acres of coal land. There was coal shortage because of the war, and FA said, well, not me. I'm going to find a way around that. I'll just buy a coal mine, and the coal can come right to Goodyear. They also had to purchase 100 train cars to move it. So from Edina up to Akron. Still working on the housing shortage as well. They actually built, they call it a cantonment house. It's a dormitory that housed up to 1,000 men adjacent to the Goodyear factory at the same time to help with that housing shortage. So there's an interior shot of, it almost looks like a hospital, but dormitory style living for Goodyear workers. So as I mentioned, part of this expansion was a deliberate effort by Goodyear to control all of these raw materials and control the manufacturing process from start to finish. And possibility really seemed endless at this time. Between 1914 and 1916, automobile production tripled. And truck and bus output was 5 times higher between 1914 and 1916. So there seemed no end to the need for tires. The war in Europe had also introduced Goodyear to all these different foreign markets that they hadn't been introduced to before. And there was a lot of potential overseas that they saw. So the strategy always had been and continued to be bold, take risks, and only look forward. So of course, to fund all this, you need money. So in addition to just profit that they were making, they did a series of stock issues between 1916 and 1920. Now, there's 2 types of stock that Goodyear offered, common stock and preferred stock. I might not do it full justice to explain the difference, but common stock was a less expensive stock that you could purchase, and it paid a smaller dividend. So preferred stock was a more expensive stock, and of course the basic premise is it paid a higher dividend. So some people owned both, some owned one or the other. Both were supporting the company, both were given dividends when Goodyear was making a profit. So you can see just massive numbers, millions and millions of dollars year after year that he's raising. And with the exception of 1916, you can see how the numbers are not even numbers. That's because they issued more than was purchased. So people started to grow a little weary of all these stock askings. They like, I've already invested, I have no more to give. So that's why you're seeing where, for example, in 1917, they probably issued 25 million shares, or what $25 million of common, only 20 million, just over 20 million was subscribed. So they're starting to see this difference between what they needed and what they were actually receiving. They even did a campaign for their own employees. They talked about how every Goodyearite should be a stockholder. And they employed things like the Wingfoot Clan and other advertising initiatives to try to sell these stocks to their employees. Every industrian a stockholder in 1920. You don't need a fortune to become a Goodyear stockholder. Believing in Goodyear's future as you do, can you afford to pass up this opportunity? Were some of the slogans that they used. And by November of 1919, over 17,000 employees owned Goodyear stock, totaling over $7 million. So people did subscribe. they did believe in the company. They believed in the Seiberlings, and they kind of actually put their money where their mouth was in a lot of ways. The sales force was even employed to sell Goodyear stock when they were out in their different territories as well, selling to vendors, selling to customers. They had a campaign where buy 2 shares of preferred and get a common share. So they kind of did these little bundles to try to incentivize people to buy stock. So the war begins, starting in 1917. All efforts kind of turned to those war contracts. The government, of course, began to control imports, especially of raw materials that were needed for the war effort. So this really curtails domestic production for Goodyear. They sold automobile and truck tires to the military. They made gas masks, as well as an assortment of what were called mechanical goods, anything that was made of rubber that the military would need. They underwent a labor shortage at this time. 6,200 Goodyear employees were drafted or joined the military for World War I, so they had to fill the ranks with women. We have a picture of some women working in the rubber factory on the left. And then also deaf workers as well were employed to help fill that void. This is a mustering photo of a bunch of Akron men leaving to get on the trains and head overseas on the right. Of course, we're all familiar with their aeronautics program. They were the only rubber company in the country that had an active aeronautics program when World War I started, so they were well ahead of the game. They built 822 observation balloons and 39 blimps for the military, and then Wingfoot Lake was also used as a training facility for the Navy at that time. So when the war ends, it still seems pretty good. November 11th, 1918, peace is declared in Europe. It takes a little time to kind of unwind, get everyone back stateside, get things back on track. But 1919 sales remain really strong, and projections for the future are good. There's not a ripple in the pond at this point. Everything is pointing to Goodyear's just going to pick up where it left off pre-World War I and just keep sailing forward with record numbers. So January 1920, they're on track with their projections. They're meeting their sales goals. And then through the spring, their projections their sales numbers begin to exceed projections. That peaks in April of 1920. And from there, it's just a downward slide where month after month, they start to get behind. They're not meeting their projections anymore, and it's doubling and doubling and doubling month after month after month. And the way that rubber production works, and this was true for every rubber company, this was not exclusive to Goodyear, is that you had to buy your raw materials, basically tire fabric and crude rubber, well ahead of time. Those were fixed prices. So let's say that, for example, rubber is 50 cents a pound. When you sign that contract, you're paying 50 cents a pound. 6 months later, even at that time, if the price had dropped to 25 cents a pound, you're locked into that contract price. And this is what happened. April 1920, the world is amazing. We're going to exceed our sales goals. FA projected maybe making over $250 million in 1920 alone, which would have been a record for the company. So he starts to create contracts with the raw material companies to get a lot of material over here. Let's get ready. We're going to start producing a ton of tires. He gets locked into prices that within months, he's underwater on those prices. And the way that it would work is you would buy those materials on credit. Once the tires were made and sold, then you would pay those people back for the materials that you purchased. This was common practice. Again, all the rubber companies did it. Goodyear got underwater. So they bought all these materials. They bought them at high prices. They were committed to those contracts. No one was buying tires all of a sudden. They weren't making any money. They still had to pay all of these contracts. They had these obligations. So he has to start to scramble around to start to figure out a way to backfill in some money to keep the company going. And so he starts to travel around the Midwest to different banks, different personal relationships he had to say, hey, can you help me out? Can you make me a loan? And he's basically just kind of borrowing from Peter to pay Paul, trying to move that money around. And really at this point in 1920, from everything I've read, no one was concerned. No one in the company was worried because Goodyear had gotten in many difficulties before and FA had always gotten them out of it. So there was this really unwavering belief that FA could solve any problem. And so it was just like, FA will handle it. He's handled it before. They almost shut down in 1903. He found a way out of it. There were times in the very early years they weren't meeting payroll. FA always got it done. So really the workers and the general public in Akron who maybe had inside knowledge of this, no one was concerned at this time. So then the recession really hits. The entire kind of government and financial structure really starts to shut down. Businesses start to close. Things are really looking dire in the winter of 1920. So let's see if my pop-ups are going to work. So the first thing FA did is he went to Goldman Sachs in New York City and said, I need immediate cash to meet my needs. Will you float me a loan? And Goldman Sachs says, yes, we will. So they gave Goodyear $25 million to meet those most immediate needs. Then after that, they requested, though, you have to have an audit done of the company. We want to see where you are financially. So they hired Pricewaterhouse to do the audit. So this disclosed for the first time, December of 1920, that there was an account due, basically a president's account or an executive account that showed up on the books of Goodyear for the first time, totaling $3.5 million. So this was made public for the first time and created some buzz about, well, what was this money used for? Why did he have this account? We'll circle back to that. So then Goodyear hires a lawyer, Paul Kravitz, from Kravitz Henderson in de Gersdorf, to help work out the financing. Paul Kravitz is the man that recommends Dillon, Reed & Company of New York City to facilitate the reorganization. He introduces Clarence Dillon to F.A. Seiberling and says, this is company in New York, can help you out. This is what they do. So at the end of December 2020, oh, I put 2020. 1920. Just noticed that. Maybe if I didn't say anything, none of you would have noticed. They have a kind of emergency stockholder meeting. They increase the board of directors from 7 to 11, and they also update the code of regulations. They add 32 amendments. It's not clear to me from my research if this was the first time the code of regulations had been updated in about 20 years, or if this was just a very necessary at this time, but it's described as modernizing the code of regulations. So apparently, when Goodyear started, of course, it was a small business, and now we're an international company, and I think the implication is that code of regulations had not stayed current with where they were financially. And then, of course, January 28th, 1921, a refinancing plan is proposed. So this is the refinancing plan that's proposed to Goodyear. So there's kind of two loans, $30 million first mortgage over 20 years, and then a $27.5 million over 10 years. And then you have these different groups of stock, and then a new thing called management stock, a $10,000 management stock. So you have preferred and common, and then you see this management stock for the first time. So all of these stocks that fall into this box were all given to the bankers as incentives. So the bankers that came to do this refinancing, which was funneled through Dillon, Reed & Company of New York, but it involved several other banks that were giving this money, saying, okay, we will loan you this money. This is basically what they were getting in return, short term. But the reorganization was also written that those that controlled the preferred and management stock controlled the company. They got to elect the board of directors. They got to decide who the president of the company was. So it basically took control away from the other stockholders, the regular Goodyear stockholders, and put it in the hands of these bankers that were paying to refinance Goodyear. So in theory, this would terminate after the first mortgage was retired. That's 20 years away. So they've decided to turn over control of their company for this long amount of time, this potentially long amount of time. So here are some of the bankers. Let's meet them. Clarence Dillon, Reed & Company, ran this New York company. We have Owen Young. He actually worked for General Electric. And then John Sherwin was a banker at the Union Trust, which became Cleveland Trust in Cleveland, Ohio. So these were the three names that you hear the most. When the lawsuits start, these are the three heavy hitters. These are the three men that hold the most stock. And these are the ones that kind of get the wrath of the locals, the common stockholders saying, we want our company back. We don't want you to control it anymore. So FA at that time is offered to stay on as a figurehead. And actually there's this, I'm going to read, it's a little long, but I hope you'll bear with me because it's very interesting. This is a letter that he wrote to a business associate, Arthur Kudner, June 14th, 1921. So just a month after he stepped down on May 13th. And he's describing his process of going through this. So for 6 months prior to the fateful Friday the 13th, I was subjected to enormous mental strain, which would have shattered the average man not endowed with the health and strength that I possessed. I had a part in building up a great business, gathering around me an army of young men and women with whom I had personal contact that established a bond which could not be severed without almost vital shock. Unconsciously, during all the period of our building, I had built a goodwill that radiated over the United States and to further limits, which brought 60,000 investors into my enterprise, never feeling that these had in any sense come in on account of my relation to it, but solely on account of its attractive money-making possibilities. I've had to bear the sorrow of feeling that these people had at least made a paper loss on account of their faith in me, and the hardest blow I've had to bear has been the shock of separation from the organization that I had had the major part in building. Hold on. A few bankers in Wall Street were bound that I should be eliminated. They said I couldn't be controlled, and they were right. Dylan, the key man, insisted I must be retained. They compromised by making an offer to continue my salary for 5 years as chairman of an advisory committee, a recognition of my nuisance value in an effort to bind and fetter me so that I would not be free to engage in the rubber industry. I told them that I was trained to lead, that I could not function with anyone over me save a board of directors, that I would stay by 100% until the reorganization plan was put through, and thereafter there should be no commitment on either side, that I might be free to act according to my own interests, and that is the program that carried. I hope within a month to start anew in some business that even in these desperate times shall have the promise of a fair measure of success, at least to the extent of giving my family a living. Stripped of money and power, burdened with debt, my outlook might seem disheartening, but it is not so. The greatest pleasure I had in life was starting at the scratch line with Goodyear, without a dollar, and all the difficulties that were encountered that had to be surmounted. The pleasure of such a battle I'm going to have all over again in the effort to construct from nothing. And though the span of life ahead of me may not be sufficient to build another Goodyear, I'm going to achieve something and have pleasure out of it all the way. So that's his feeling on Clarence. So I had not realized till finding that letter, I knew that they had offered him a position, kind of an advisory. I didn't realize it was a 5-year deal, but I think Clarence Dillon very smartly said, if he works for us, we can control him, we can keep him quiet, and F.A. said, absolutely not. I think he knew, and he said very candidly in interviews that if him stepping down from Goodyear meant the preservation of the company, he was happy to do it. He wanted Goodyear to stay around. It employed over 10,000 people at one point in Akron. It was the lifeblood of the city in many ways, and he would not stand in the way for his own personal gain to the detriment of everyone else in the city. But at the same time, he also wasn't going to sit by in an organization and let these other people come in and kind of dismantle his business. So just to show you the change in leadership, so the highlighted names are the 3 people that were retained: Paul Litchfield, George Stottleman, and then W.D. Schiltz. Everyone else was let go or quit during the reorganization. Most of these treasurers and comptrollers that they brought in were outside people. Price Waterhouse had recommended them, or some of the other organizational businesses that were involved had recommended them again to kind of get those finances back in line. So, and again, here's a change in the board of directors. So all Akron people on the left. On the right, the only Akron person is Paul Litchfield. Everyone else, with the exception of Edward Wilmer, who was the incoming president of the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, are bankers. So during the reorganization, a lot is revealed about the structure of Goodyear. And of course, F.A. becomes blamed for a lot of things and criticized for the way that he handled things. So I'll just kind of talk through very quickly some of the more key criticisms of him. It was said that he was not kind of very financially savvy. He didn't have a clear idea on the commitments for rubber and fabric. Hold on a second. There was no structured budget system in the company. Checks were only signed by one person. There was no controller at Goodyear. Fire and other insurance coverage was poorly handled, and they were paying high rates. There was no supervision of taxes at that time. There was no control of real estate. It was divided amongst all the different departments and even all the different plants around the country. There was no central law department, no legal control over contracts. Individual departments could just sign their own contracts instead of it being centralized in some way. And there was no cooperation sometimes between Akron and California, Akron and Canada. Those relationships were still being formed. Those were new kind of entities, and so things were being worked out there. So those were some of the more public criticisms that were made. And I think, of course, as I said, Goodyear started as this very small company, grew very rapidly, and some of that infrastructure I don't think had really caught up yet at that point. FA, and probably in many ways, was still running it as his company, as a small company, whereas it needed to evolve and be more structured in a lot of ways. Is that what led to the reorganization? That's probably debatable. There's also a line out there, and I'm not an economist, so I can't argue it one way or the other, that there were these outside forces within the economy at that time that were impacting Goodyear, and what did that play into the reorganization as well, or getting Goodyear into those circumstances. So that was also something to consider. So here's Edward Wilmer, the new president of Goodyear, 1921. He's 38 years old. He has no experience in the rubber business. He came from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He manufactured steel, coke, gas, and other chemicals was his experience. There's a rumor, I didn't have time to really look into it, that he's also the brother-in-law of Clarence Dillon. That's published in the newspaper. He denies it. Edward denies it when he's interviewed. So I have to go on Ancestry and find out if it's true. But he is brought in. He has very close ties to the Dillon Reed and Company. And so, of course, is kind of just plucked in or placed into Goodyear at this time to run the company with all of these bankers as his board of directors. So FA steps down. He doesn't have a job right now. He's in some financial distress. So we talked about that account that shows up in the audit of $3.6 million. So that's still hanging out there to be resolved by Goodyear. He also, his debts at this time total about $6.7 million, both personal and related to Goodyear. He's borrowed over $300,000 from his children and almost $200,000 from his wife, Gertrude. Most of the real estate in his name, which includes properties in downtown Akron, farmland in Ohio, Michigan, and Florida, are fully mortgaged. And most of those loans at the time were secured using Goodyear common stock, which at this time is worthless because Goodyear's not paying dividends. So he's in debt at this point. So what he does, his next move, he wants to start a second rubber company. He already has this ambition that he's going to form another rubber company. So he has to look like he has money on paper, even if he doesn't in reality. So he forms the Prudential Security Company. He transfers all of his debts and mortgages to this company. It was organized in August of 1921. This is basically a list that is listed in some of the paperwork of the company of all of the assets that he has left. So these different amounts of stock and then his real estate holdings. It does not include any property in Gertrude's name, which we all know means Stan Hywet was not included. Stan Hywet wasn't mortgaged. Stan Hywet was not affected by any of this reorganization because it is in Gertrude's name the whole time. So 43 parcels of land, though, with a value of $4.3 million, all of which are mortgaged. So this is the sum total of what he is worth at this point. So this is all turned over to the security company, Prudential Security Company, of which F.A. Seiberling is the sole stockholder. It's just smoke and mirrors, this accounting. So he's able to go out and secure loans based on these stock holdings to help to pay his debts off. The notes mature in 1923. He's still not able to pay them off 2 years later. Extensions are issued through 1926. By 1926, he's reduced his debt to $5 million, from 6.3 to $5 million. But again, still, he owns a lot of Goodyear common and preferred stock. It still continues to be worthless at this time. So it's only through the generosity of a friend named Edgar Davis, who worked for the U.S. Rubber Company and also was an oil tycoon down in Texas, who stepped in to guarantee unconditionally all of his debts with the banks. And that basically gets the banks off his back for the time being. So we'll press pause on that. And then all of these things, it's hard to tell the story because all of these things are overlapping. So you have to keep in mind they're all kind of happening at the same time. So the first lawsuit that happens post-reorganization is in 1922. It's called the Kennedy suit. So the Leonard Kennedy Company, they're basically kind of headhunters. They're a management company. They get brought in when a company needs to hire a management team, hire an executive director. So they are hired by Goodyear to find them a new executive director. They are the ones that hire Edward Wilmer. They also place a treasurer at Goodyear. The problem with the Kennedy Company is it is almost entirely owned by Clarence Dillon. And Edward Wilmer also has a controlling stake in the Kennedy Company. So it's very incestuous. The Kennedy Company is also making a ton of money at this time. Goodyear agreed to pay them $250,000 a year, plus additional compensation of 5% of the company profits if they make over $10 million, but not to exceed if they make $20 million. So just for placing an executive director, this is this contract that Goodyear signs to give them, to pay them. And of course, this is all getting funneled back to Clarence Dillon, to Edward Wilmer at the time. So there are 4 different suits. You can see this was kind of the easiest way. I hate writing on slides, I apologize, but this was the only way I could see to do it. There's also attempts, so the first suit, of course, is to throw out the Kennedy Company, to abolish that contract, get rid of that so Goodyear isn't saddled with these payments. They also, of course, are trying to already break the reorganization agreement. They want to get rid of that management stock that belongs almost entirely to John Sherwin, Clarence Dillon, and Owen Young, which is giving them controlling interest of Goodyear. And then they also go after the entire directors of the Union Trust Company, and that common stock that was given basically as a bonus to those banks. They want that to be released from the bankers and reissued back to the public so the public can try to get control back of Goodyear. So these 4 different suits. It was brought by a woman named Laura Weiss of Cleveland. She was a Goodyear common stockholder. There were many similar lawsuits at this time between about like 1923 and 1925. She was the first to file. So she kind of gets all the accolades in the history of Goodyear. When it comes to the Kennedy lawsuits, everyone talks about Laura Weiss. So there's an article, August 9th, 1922, Akron Beacon Journal. F.A. Seiberling, former president of Goodyear, has no interest in the litigation, was not consulted about it, and was not in a position to know of it before it was filed. However, said Watchner, Seiberling's interests as a stockholder are affected by the Weiss action. Of course, there's a lot of buzz in town. Is F.A. behind the scenes pulling the ropes? Is he the one making the decisions? He denies that he's involved with this, but you can't imagine he didn't know. So she is successful. This goes through court. And in 1923, she is able to get the Kennedy contract discontinued, as you see that bottom article. So it's canceled by Goodyear at their annual meeting of 1923. Wilmer is just reelected president. He's given a salary of $50,000, paid through by Goodyear. So Kennedy Company is out at this point. They weren't able to address this. The other 3 suits were dismissed. Really, that first suit was the only one that was found in favor of Weiss. The other ones were dismissed. But of course, shortly after this, Wilmer's not getting all these kickbacks anymore. He steps down as president of Goodyear. He's not interested anymore. And George Stottleman is elected as the new president of Goodyear, back to kind of a local person at least being in the executive director position. At the same time, FA is going through a patent lawsuit that's been going on for 10 years. So this is over, again, the Seiberling State tire building machine. He patented it. He licensed it out to other rubber companies and then collected royalties from it. But of course, as time goes by, people start to modify his design, change things. He brings lawsuits against them saying that they are infringing on his patent. They claim their design is new and different. It's not an infringement. Here we are 10 years later, still trying to settle it in court. It goes all the way to the United States Supreme Court, this case, this infringement. And FA had the same lawyer for 10 years. On the eve of the case being heard on the Supreme Court, his lawyer passes away. So he has to hire, with about 6 weeks to go, an entirely new patent attorney who he said didn't have the time to really dive into all the nuances of the case. So unfortunately, he loses the case. This would have released $5 million in royalties to FA and would have resolved his debt issues years earlier than they were. But I have to read a quote because I love it. He describes his experience at the Supreme Court. He's writing to his Henrietta Seiberling's father, Judge Buckler. So it was my first experience in the Supreme Court and very interesting to me. At one time, it seemed as though 5 of the judges were either drowsy or asleep. In fact, the only minds that kept alert were those of Taft, Sutherland, and Sanford. Justice Holmes, who I think is over 80, I'm sure passed away several times while the arguments were in process. But perhaps they have the view that they must listen to the verbal pyrotechnics as a matter of form. In their private sanctums, they do the delving that gets them to the bottom of the case. I won in the Court of Appeals in the Third Circuit, having lost in the Court of Appeals in the Sixth Circuit. No matter what decree the court may render, I have the satisfaction of knowing that I'm the first human being of record to conceive the idea of making tires mechanically, the first to take out a patent for a machine, and the first to have constructed a machine that did the work. So that was 1924 when the decision was made. So 1926, we're now 5 years past the reorganization of 1921. I couldn't find Russell's photograph, so unfortunately he gets a blank square. So F.A. Seiberling, Henry Manton, who is his brother-in-law, and Russell Robinson, who is a well-known businessman in Akron, have controlling interest of the Goodyear common stock. They are the 3 largest stockholders of Goodyear common. Right now, though, they really have not a lot of authority because the stock is valueless. But it's been 5 years. Goodyear is looking to refinance their plan to try to pay down some of these high interest rates that they had to accept in 1921. They're looking to see if they can get out from under some of that. They need Seiberling, Manton, and Robinson to agree to the reorganization plan as the 3 largest stockholders. They refuse. They say, we will sign your reorganization on certain conditions. And so this is also, he's writing to Judge Buckler again. I suppose you've seen something in the newspaper about the fight I'm having with Wall Street. The material you have read would not be very accurate, as the Dillon Crown are shaping the publicity as much as they can to suit their desires and to put the slant their way. We've locked horns for a fight to the finish on the proposition of eliminating Wall Street financial control in Goodyear affairs. They have hundreds of millions. I have nothing except a burning sense that justice must be done and will eventually come out of this fight, and I'm going to stay by it to the end without regard to the personal consequences to me. So this kicks off a series of lawsuits by common stockholders. Again, Tomlinson is the one that gets talked about the most. He's one of many individuals that just starts to sue Goodyear to, again, break the reorganization of 1921. There are cases going on simultaneously, as I said, 4 and 5 at a time. Some are in the Ohio Supreme Court. Some are in the Court of Common Pleas. They're in Toledo. They're in Akron. They're in Cincinnati. They're going, and then the newspapers talk about them as this big kind of messy group, and it's hard to extract what's going on. But this was basically what they were asking for: the Dillon to be removed. They were asking for all of that stock that's being held by the bankers to be retired or issued to the public. And they were asking for the board of directors to include more local representation. And it took about 18 months, but they got it. So this is what happened as an outcome of those cases. So Dillon Reed will just act as just bankers. They no longer have any control in Goodyear at all. No control over stock, nothing of that. They retired some of the bonds and the prior preferred stock, which would save Goodyear an average of $1.1 million a year in interest charges. The voting trusts were all eliminated. Management stock was all retired, no longer owned by Dillon, Sherwin, and Young. Control returned to the common stockholders. No change in company management, but they did add 4 additional seats to the board. And of course, there were all these charges and counter charges that were happening. So all of that was kind of dropped with one exception. So, yes, FA is sued by Goodyear at the time for in 2 lawsuits. So he's the first lawsuit was accused. He's saying he owed Goodyear $1.3 million. The second lawsuit was saying he owed them $2 million. Basically, we're back to that $3.6 million that showed up in that 1920 audit. They said that FA owed them. So, and John Sherwin, he's pictured here, a younger picture of him on the right, had a very public article in the Akron Beacon Journal where he detailed through that audit between 1912 and 1920 all of the times that FA had taken money out for personal reasons. And he said they wrote checks to himself. They were Goodyear checks written to himself, cashed. The money is not shown to be for any kind of Goodyear expense. So the assumption is it was used personally. FA would usually return the money just prior to the audit. so that it kind of wiped that account out and it wasn't recognized. The only exception being 1920. He didn't have $3.8 million to return at that time. That's why it showed up on the audit. FA, I haven't been able to find anywhere where FA responds to this or explains it in any way. So we only have really on record one side of the story. FA was asked to turn over as collateral for this debt his interest in the Akron-Canton Railroad Company, bonds that he owned in the Midland Continental Railroad Company, which was up in North Dakota, and a few other things, some other assets he was turned over. What happened is Goodyear decided to sell those Akron-Canton Youngstown Railroad shares, and they didn't meet the debt that was owed. So they decided to sue Goodyear for the rest of the money because they were a little annoyed that the collateral didn't equal the value of what they deemed was owed to them. So when those lawsuits go through, everything is resolved. The exception is this was not cleared off of the books at that time. And FA is quoted, or it's quoted in the Akron Beacon Journal, May 1927. Throughout the entire negotiation for an adjustment of the Goodyear litigation, Mr. F.A. Seiberling at all times insisted that all claims between him and the company be left out of the negotiations and settlement, and this has been done. It was his thought and desire that no personal interest of his should in any way affect or influence the terms of the settlement. So it seemed it was F.A.'s desire to not be included. He determined he would handle this separately. And this is the part of the story that continues into the 1930s. This actually isn't resolved until about 1936. So he and Goodyear continue to go back and forth over this $3.6 million. So, but with those lawsuits, Goodyear is now free of the Dillon and Reed Company. I think this is such a poorly worded title. And Goodyear control battles. I had to read it several times before it was like, oh, and Goodyear control battles. Like that's where you put the emphasis on the sentence. So it's over. Goodyear's out. Goodyear is back in control of local ownership. They are able to put people, actually Henry Manton, Russell Robinson, Francis Seiberling, who's a local lawyer and a congressman, and F.A.'s cousin. They all join the board of Goodyear. There's more local representation. Goodyear common stock immediately shoots up in value as soon as all these bankers leave Goodyear. The company is viewed publicly as more solvent and stronger because it's outside of the bounds of those that control. So this proves very well for F.A. because, as we mentioned, he has that $6.7 million debt, all that debt that's held with the Prudential Security Company. So basically overnight, his common stock doubles. It goes from $4 million, which wasn't quite enough to pay his debts, to $8.3 million. So there is a story of how he walks into a bank in Cleveland, and some say it's cash. I don't know if that's true. That seems like a lot of cash to walk in, but he basically pays off all of these bankers that he owes money to. So as of January 1928, he is debt-free for all intents and purposes. And so what do you do when you finally get out of debt, out of a decade? You have a party. So they threw what they called the hilarity ball. Actually, it happened just before he paid off his debts, but he knew he was going to do it. This was kind of a New Year's Eve party, 1927, and they all dressed up in costume and had a big celebration because it basically seemed like this is it, it's over, we survived it, we can now move on, we have some money in the bank, everything's looking great, and what do we know happens in 15 months? Then the stock market crashes, right? So that's where part 2 picks up. So that is it, everyone. If anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them. Oh gosh, yes.
They have the dormitories in Goodyear. Did the workers have to pay for that?
Oh, that's a good question. Probably. I would guess yes, but I don't know for sure.
Like if they have, something to eat and everything?
Oh, I don't know if it was room and board. That I don't know. Yeah. It just talks about it being kind of like a dormitory. Yes, Harriet.
Russell, I can fill in something for you. Russell Robinson was a cousin of Henry Manton's. He was part of the Robinson Clay Products Company. And just anecdotally, he employed a secretary named Bina Carter who never got married. She built the home that Rex Humbard eventually bought on North Portage Path. Russell left her, I guess, most of his fortune think he died without children, and I'll clarify all this for you for your facts, but he left her most of his money. She built that home on North Portage Path, and Rex Humbard eventually bought it.
Oh, interesting.
Buying Carter, Russell Robinson's secretary.
Got it. Yes.
So when did he and his brother start the Seiberling Rubber Company?
Yeah.
They started in the fall of 1921, so they took about 6 months off, but really they stepped down in May. I think it's in June, end of June, they purchased a rubber company in Pennsylvania, Newcastle, Pennsylvania. And that, in theory, was they played around with the idea of that being where they were going to start their next rubber company. And then by the end of the summer, early fall, the Portage Rubber Company in Barberton becomes available. And that, of course, makes much more sense. So they purchased that one and eventually divest themselves of the Newcastle one.
But it wasn't connected at all with any of these other financial.
Part 2. It all gets messier in the 1930s, much messier. So, Eileen.
For those of us who are tour guides, what are the 1 or 2 sentences that you would like us to say?
Yeah. Right. I know a lot of this is on that time, a very pared down version. We tried to put as much as simply as possible on that timeline in the billiard room. So I think that'd be a good place to point people. I think it's important to say it wasn't as simple as he left Goodyear and it was over. I think that's what I definitely learned many years ago, because when I first started here, that was my impression. Oh, he left Goodyear and 6 months later, he started Seiberling and he never had anything to do with Goodyear again. Well, here he remained super invested in Goodyear, and as even a common stockholder, he continued to be a common stockholder, and was always very invested in Goodyear. So I think that's probably the most important point. Cindy.
Do we know how much it took to get Seiberling Rubber up and running? And did they both put money in, he and Charles?
Yes, and I don't have those numbers off the top of my head, but they did what a lot of business owners do, is they took ads in the paper to subscribe people to buy stock to support them in this new effort. So again, it's like, hey, if you're a member of the community, you want to get behind my business. Of course, if you buy stock in a company and it ends up doing well, you make a lot of money. So, but yeah, they subscribed, they did some stock subscription. And then I'm not sure I don't remember off the top of my head personally how much he would have put in. Yes.
I was curious, at the time that they got out of all of the mess and lawsuits Goodyear before the Depression had started, do we know what the price of the common share was and preferred share when it all of a sudden rebounded, where FA was able?
Yeah, I don't know that off the top of my head, so yeah.
It's probably not what we think of today.
No, I know it was, I think it was about $5 kind of before, and I think it might have gone up, well, if it doubled, I think it went up to 10 or 15. That might have been just the common, yeah. Yeah, so if you were able to hang on to your stock as a Goodyear employee or something, you saw a nice rebound, but I think a lot of people, of course, panicked and said, I just have to get rid of this. You know, I'd try to salvage some sort of money in 21 or 22. So. Alan.
In what weight or partnership did the CW's responsibilities come into this? Or was it all on FA?
Yeah, he's never mentioned. He's not really mentioned in the lawsuits. I think his finances were not tied up the way FA's were. So he actually, when he passed away, there was money left. He was probably a little more, I don't want to say smarter, more conservative with some of his business decisions. The FA tended to take more risks. He always, of course, 95% of the time, he got the reward. But this was that one time where that gamble didn't pay off. Sharon.
Did he have any savings when all this started, or was it all on paper?
Oh, no, I don't think there was much savings, because the way that the newspaper articles talk about it, and even he himself talks about it, is he put everything he had back into Goodyear in 1920 to keep it solvent. So I think he does articulate, I use my own personal finances. So I think the implication to me then is any savings he had were put back into the company. Yes?
Do we know how much he was earning a year in those early?
We know. I don't know if I don't want to give the wrong number. I'm on tape. So I'll tell you next week when I see you in the house, or Thursday. We know it, I just don't know it. I don't want to give the wrong number. So, Emma.
Did FA keep common stock all the way up till 1955?
The 30s gets, yes, the 30s gets tricky. He does have to sell a lot of it in the 30s. So, Sharon again.
But he had given stock to his kids earlier, had he not?
They gifted a lot of it back. During the 30s, it's like, it's a crazy game of back and forth of him saying, can I borrow this back? I'll return it. That really doesn't happen. The returning doesn't happen. And the kids, to their credit, said, well, Dad, this is yours. You gave this to us. You earned it. Have it back. Like, there were no hard feelings of, you're bleeding me dry, Dad. What's going on? You know, they were very, they had no skin in the game when it came to that stock. They really saw it as his originally, and he had gifted it to them, but they were happy to return it. So, but it, in reality, it created a ton of financial issues for them as well, because I did a presentation, I think 5 years ago, where I talked about the 1930s, and both Virginia and Irene were devastated by the Depression, and their husbands had really difficult financial times, and they gave all that money back to their dad, which again, they were happy to do, but it placed them in a very precarious financial position as well. So, Harriet.
One thing for part two, but my brother, who's in the back of the room, has read Clarence Dillon's autobiography, and there is a backhanded compliment in it, which probably was backhanded, but Clarence Dillon stated in his autobiography that he knew that Goodyear was a sound company, and that asset-wise, it was a very good deal, and he was almost gleeful in his autobiography about being able to take on the company and to assume control of it, and he realized he'd gotten in kind of a jam at a time when circumstance, as you described, circumstance, had they been just a little bit different, right? Had they had a little more time, had not, had this, had a perfect storm, that would have happened. But that's an interesting.
And I think also the other thing that I learned doing research for this was that Dillon, Reed and Company were working on another deal right around 1926. They actually purchased the Dodge Company and reorganized that company as well. So I think also they were like, well, we'll just leave Akron. Up to Detroit we go. And
Wilmer was installed as
Wilmer was put in, what do you know, executive director of the Dodge Company. So yeah, I think at that point, they were over the lawsuits. They were over having to pay all the legal fees. They had this whole other new project, which was probably more financially beneficial to them. So they were kind of happy to be like, that's fine, we're out. Off we go. We'll move on to this next project. So.
I'm anxious for section 3.
Well, thanks so much, everyone.
Many thanks to Julie Frey for sharing her vast knowledge of Stan Hywet Hall and the Seiberling family with the Stan Hywet Guild members. The Stan Hywet Guild and the Stan Hywet Hall and Gardens partners in volunteer service to benefit the beautiful and historic Seiberling family estate of Stan Hywet.